I just want to say a few things about the essay that you've done on Anthony of Egypt. Seeing it's the first one, I won't be saying this every week, but just to give you an idea, because of the weeks to come, of the kind of material that you'll be submitting. Um, First of all, I'm very pleased that you took credence of what I said in my first week when I told you what good writing was and what the expectations were. No casual language, no jargon, basically writing in a straightforward, simple way that effectively gets your point across, and that you're writing in an academic sense. So in other words, you don't elide words together, can do rather than can't or don't, and you use language that's fitting for a university context. All this is very important because later on, when you become a professional in whatever sphere that you're in, when you send out a memo to 500 employees, that memo must stand by itself and must not be of select language that only you can understand, that people have to phone in or cell phone you and find out exactly what it is that you're actually trying to say. It's got to stand by itself. So I was pleased with that from that standpoint. Now, the thing that I'm looking for that you need to know is when you write, what you do is you look at the syllabus and you see what is it that the syllabus asked me to do with this essay. What are the requirements of it? And if you look through the syllabus, there were 4 requirements, basically giving a historical context in which Anthony lived, an understanding of brief basic biography, and then an evaluation of his main theological ideas, an evaluation of it in respect to its connection not just with behavior but with the theology of it. That is, where does it stand biblically or within the context of the church, what you can find out from reading of Armstrong, and then an application to yourself. In fact, I want to suggest to you that one of the ways that you can really facilitate this is, after you've read Armstrong, go to another source, a useful source that is reasonably scholarly and can be used effectively is Wikipedia. You could go to Wikipedia and then skim through the material on Anthony and just get another perspective, because don't forget that Armstrong has got his own perspective on it. He's basically a Protestant, and he's writing about a Catholic or Orthodox hero of the faith, and he makes his points. He advocates what Anthony, how he lived and what he did. He advocates that as a genuine stance of what it means to be a true Christian, but at the same time he actually says what? He says that we're in a situation where we don't pray to saints. Well, that's a Protestant perspective, not a Catholic perspective. And so therefore you need to be aware of that, and you can, as you evaluate it, that you evaluate what Armstrong is saying about Anthony, whether you agree or disagree with it, from the standpoint, and of course if you agree or disagree with it, then you've got to give reasons of why you disagree or why you agree. For example, just looking in a very general way at Anthony, you could say such things as that there were no models, it looks like, in the early church in terms of devotional classics and people to follow like we have today, like people like C.S. Lewis, or the works of Tolkien with Lord of the Rings, or the thousands of books by spiritual men and women that encourage us. So therefore, something like what Athanasius wrote about Anthony would be something that would be grabbed on immediately, because it could be then a way through which people could see a model on how to live the Christian life. At the same time, you could argue that because, as Armstrong brings out, that Anthony was the father of monasticism, if you know anything about monasticism from what you've read, you could general reading in terms of what is monasticism, you'd have seen that then he was the father, so to speak, of those who kept learning going right through the Middle Ages that took us into the time of the Renaissance Sunday Reformation period. So from that standpoint, he's very important. It's also important from the standpoint of solidifying the New Testament canon. That's the number of books that were finally accepted in the early church as being biblical. Athanasius basically was very instrumental in putting this together. You get that? Athanasius, who put together the books of the New Testament under the emperor, was also the one who wrote the definitive biography of Antony. There's connections that are there. So in other words, then, if you look at a basic timeline, that Antony was born in 251, died in 356, and the canon was sort of put together in its final form in 367. Then the book that Athanasius wrote about Antony was also a model through which he could facilitate other ideas, expanding the canon to the 27 books so that there was no dispute. And also, of course, orthodoxy, because Athanasius was very strong in showing how Antony went, and I think it was in Alexandria, went and rebuked Arianism, the other competing view of who Jesus was at that particular time, as you'll come across that in the debates in terms of the Trinity and whether Jesus was God or not. So those were all positive elements that came out of the chapter in respect to who Anthony was. And then you ask yourself critically, and you've got to think critically. It's not just a question of you accept what Armstrong says and you say, oh, this individual, Anthony, is such a fine figure. And some of you said this, that we should all follow. Well, there's a certain what you might call element of Protestantism that doesn't agree with that, and that's Protestantism. For one thing, you have to ask the question of that if Anthony spent 20 years perfecting his spirituality by himself in a tomb, or in a mountainside or wherever he was when he left organized society. 20 years is a long time. Jesus spent 40 days in the desert preparing himself for his ministry. Would 20 years be sufficient? In other words, would that be a Christian model? When you look at someone, perhaps the best example I think of perhaps could have been Paul, who spent 3 years after his conversion away from society, perhaps fine-tuning his faith. But Protestants would argue that that's not necessarily something that we should emulate whatsoever. And several of you brought that out in terms of the extreme nature of Anthony's spirituality. The fact that he was instrumental in leading to an asceticism in which the body was rejected and denied its place as being under the lordship of Christ, and the spirit became more the focus in terms of what should be geared and developed within the Christian. It was a sort of a dualism that was there, let alone the element of that came out later on through people like, as you'll see, with people like Augustine, perhaps Gregory, in the sense that sex was denigrated and put down. And we still suffer the element of that within the church from the Roman Catholic perspective. Just think of the celibate priests. Where does all this come from? Well, one of the strands it comes from are people like Antony, who derided sex in the sense of that the celibate life was the best life in which to follow, the only true life. So you have then the development of nuns, etc., etc. Now, I'm giving you something from a Protestant perspective, and you can criticize me on it, because I am a Protestant. I'm trying to look at Antony in a fair way. But I'm trying to give you the ability, I'm trying to give you the license, so to speak, in which to go ahead and to critique these chapters in respect to what you agree with and what you disagree with. Don't forget that Antony's biography was written by Athanasius, who had a great card to play in establishing in that Roman world the orthodoxy that was post Constantine, the emperor, and so on. And his work was collected by Eusebius and became instrumental in looking back. And as we know, history are the winners. Athanasius was the winner over Arius. And Antony's book was part of that whole process of him becoming a winner. And perhaps the last thing you could say is that what Antony did was establish further the beginnings of, if that's the case, of the clergy-laity divide. The fact that there are a special group of people who are really, really holy, and the rest of us are just normal, ordinary people who can't attain their measure. Is that commensurate with the writings of the New Testament and so on? So I'm saying to you then, you put your critical thinking hat on. That's what it means for us to be studying this material as you look and as you work it through in the essays that are that lie ahead in both McGrath's material and of course in the Saints material by Armstrong. Thank you.